think that Ranger tab means anything here, sweetheart?" The instructor's voice cut through the Virginia heat like a blade. Sergeant First Class Lennox Kai stood in the sand outside the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Compound, her OCP uniform already soaked through. While 3 Navy instructors circled her like predators who'd found wounded prey, they saw 135 pounds of wasted training slot. A woman with a tab they figured she earned in some watered-down political experiment, someone who'd be gone before the week ended. What they couldn't see was the small constellation tattooed behind her left ear. 3 stars arranged in a pattern only a dozen people in the world would recognize. A mark earned in a unit that didn't exist on any official roster, in places that had no names. The lead instructor moved closer, his breath sharp with coffee and contempt, and told her she had 72 hours to prove she belonged. He didn't know he was staring at a woman who'd walked out of Helmand Province as the sole survivor of an ambush that killed her entire team. The Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility at Coronado Island rose from the coastal fog like a fortress built on decades of suffering. Dawn hadn't broken yet, and the air carried the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and the sweat of men who believed this ground belonged to them alone. The obstacle course stretched across the sand like a skeletal monument to pain, its wooden beams darkened by years of blood and failure. In the distance, somewhere beyond the admin building, a bell rang 3 times, slow, deliberate, final. Another operator had quit an advanced course. Sergeant First Class Lennox Kai, 28 years old, stood at parade rest outside the operations building, her OCP uniform crisp despite the humidity pressing down like a wet blanket. She was 5'6", lean in the way that came from carrying 70-pound rucks through mountains for years, not from any gym. Her face was unreadable, carved from the kind of stillness that made people uneasy without understanding why. She didn't fidget. She didn't scan her surroundings like the other operators waiting nearby. She just stood there, hands locked behind her back, eyes forward, breathing slow and measured. Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached from the operations center, his khaki uniform immaculate, his expression already calibrated to skeptical. He was the senior SEAL liaison for this inter-service evaluation, a combat veteran with 18 years in 4 deployments, and a reputation for being fair but utterly unforgiving. He stopped 3 feet in front of Kai and studied her the way a mechanic examines a suspect engine. His first question wasn't about her qualifications. It was whether she understood that NSW didn't adjust standards for anyone, regardless of service branch or demographics. She told him she didn't expect them to. Her voice was flat Midwestern with no trace of defensiveness or hesitation. Hayes noted the Ranger tab on her left shoulder, the combat action badge above her ribbons, the airborne wings, and the deployment patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Solid credentials. But none of that explained why an Army Sergeant First Class was standing on SEAL training grounds for an evaluation that hadn't been briefed to the command staff. Kai's right hand moved briefly to the back of her neck, fingers brushing the base of her hairline where the small tattoo rested. A gesture so quick Hayes missed it entirely. It was a nervous habit she'd developed over 3 years. A subconscious check to make sure the mark stayed covered. Those 3 stars weren't Navy. They were something older, something off-book, and if anyone here saw them, questions would start that she wasn't authorized to answer. Hayes told her to report to the grinder at 0600s the following morning. She would be evaluated alongside a SEAL Team 5 Advanced Tactics course for 72 hours, no accommodations, no second chances. He didn't say what the evaluation was for and she didn't ask. She simply nodded, saluted, and walked toward the transient barracks. Behind her, Hayes watched her go and wondered what the hell JCC wanted with his SEALs. Lennox Kai grew up in the kind of small Indiana town where the high school football stadium had better lighting than the hospital. Her father, Marcus Kai, was a Marine Corps scout sniper who'd done 3 tours in Iraq and come home with a pronounced limp and a 1,000-yard stare he tried to hide behind weekend coaching jobs. He never talked about the war directly, but he taught his daughter how to read wind, how to control her breathing under stress, and how to make a cold bore shot at 600 meters before she turned 16. He didn't do it to make her a soldier. He did it because he believed discipline and precision could save her from a world that didn't care about rural kids with no money and fewer options. When Lennox enlisted at 19, Marcus didn't celebrate. He just nodded once, handed her his old compass, and told her to remember that every decision she made downrange would follow her home. She didn't understand what he meant until Helmand Province 2019. She'd been with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 2 years, assigned to a cultural support team attached to a special operations task force. The mission was supposed to be routine. A village clearance operation in Sangin district, hunting a Taliban facilitator who'd been moving IEDs through the area. The intel was garbage. The village was a kill box. Her team leader, First Lieutenant Vanessa Brooks, was 26 years old, a West Point graduate with a deployment to Syria under her belt and a reputation for leading from the front. Brooks was the kind of officer who made privates believe they could run through walls if she asked them to. She carried extra water for the junior enlisted. She took point on every patrol. She believed, genuinely believed, that women in combat weren't a political statement but a tactical reality, and that proving it required excellence, not excuses. They were moving through a compound courtyard, clearing the second structure, when the pressure plate detonated under Brooks' left foot. The blast wave threw Lennox into a mud brick wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs and knock the air from her lungs. When the dust settled and her vision cleared, Brooks was on the ground 10 feet away, her left leg gone below the knee, femoral artery pumping dark red blood into the dirt in rhythmic spurts. Lennox crawled through sporadic gunfire, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the tourniquet. She applied it high and tight 2 inches above the wound, cranked it down until the bleeding stopped, then dragged Brooks into cover while the rest of the squad returned fire. The medevac took 28 minutes to arrive. Brooks died in Lennox's arms at minute 22, whispering something about her sister's wedding in Boston. Words Lennox couldn't fully hear over the rotor wash and the ringing in her own ears. 2 months later, a quiet man in civilian clothes found her at Bagram and asked if she wanted to do work that mattered. No details, no promises, just a question. She said yes because staying in a regular unit felt like wearing a uniform made of guilt. The 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta Assessment and Selection nearly broke her. The operator training course did break her, twice, and she came back both times because quitting would mean Brooks had died for nothing. Delta didn't officially acknowledge women in direct action roles, so Lennox Kai became a ghost. Her operational file was compartmentalized at the TSSCI level. No public deployments, no award ceremonies, just a series of redacted after-action reports and a small constellation tattoo behind her left ear, 3 stars in Orion's belt, inked by a retired SEAL medic in a back room in Fayetteville. It was Brooks' idea, a half-joke made during a late-night conversation in a plywood hooch. Brooks had said that if they were going to be ghosts, they should at least have something to prove they'd existed. For 3 years, Kai ran missions in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, hunting high-value targets, training partner forces, conducting direct action raids that never made the news. She was good at it, so good that it scared her. Now she was here, at Coronado, because someone in JSC wanted SEALs to learn from an operator they didn't know existed, and because Lennox Kai had made a promise to Brooks that she'd never let another soldier die from ignorance or institutional arrogance. Chief Petty Officer Dane Roscoe had been an NSW instructor for 6 years, and in that time, he'd watched over 300 operators fail courses they thought they were too experienced to take seriously. Roscoe was 41, barrel-chested, with a face like sun-baked leather and a voice that could strip paint off bulkheads. He'd done 4 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq, and had a silver star he never talked about. He was also the kind of man who believed standards existed for a reason, and that reason was keeping people alive in places where mistakes meant body bags. When he saw Lennox Kai standing on the grinder at 0600, flanked by a dozen male SEAL operators from Team 5, he assumed she was support staff who'd gotten lost. Roscoe walked toward her with 2 other instructors, Petty Officer First Class Jacob Garrett and Petty Officer Second Class Anthony Lima, both SEALs with multiple combat deployments and reputations for being merciless during advanced training. Roscoe stopped 3 feet in front of Kai and asked if she knew where she was supposed to be. She told him she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He looked at her uniform, her tab, her size, and his expression shifted from confusion to something harder. He told her this wasn't some inter-service demonstration project. He told her that NSW didn't compromise on standards, and that if she thought a Ranger tab from some school meant she could hang with operators who'd been doing this for a decade, she was about to receive a painful education. Garrett, standing to Roscoe's right, muttered something about how the army must be scraping the bottom of the barrel if they were sending liaisons who looked like admin clerks. Kai's response was 4 words, delivered in a tone flat enough to land like a challenge. She told them she was ready. The first test was a timed ocean swim, 2 miles in 63-degree water, full utilities, boots, no wetsuit. Roscoe made sure she started last 30 seconds behind the slowest SEAL in the class. The current was vicious, pulling south along the coast, and halfway through, Kai's shoulders were screaming. Her core temperature dropped fast, but she didn't panic. She adjusted her stroke, angled into the current instead of fighting it, and finished 6th out of 14. When she climbed out of the water, her lips were faintly blue and her legs were shaking, but she stood at attention without complaint. Roscoe was waiting on the beach. He told her the swim didn't prove anything except that she could follow basic instructions. The whispers started that afternoon. Kai heard them in the Cho Hall, saw the looks from the SEAL operators, felt the weight of being evaluated by men who'd already decided she didn't belong. One of the SEALs, A prior service Marine named Petty Officer Second Class Voss made a comment loud enough for her to hear about how the army must be desperate if they were sending people like her to evaluate real operators. Another SEAL laughed. Kai kept eating, her face unreadable. That night, Lieutenant Commander Hayes called her into his office. He didn't offer her a seat. He told her that JC had requested this evaluation, but that Roscoe had expressed serious concerns about the disruption her presence was causing. Hayes said he respected Roscoe's judgment, and that unless she could demonstrate operational level competence in the next 48 hours, he'd recommend the evaluation be terminated early. He asked her point blank why she was really here. Kai met his eyes and told him she was here to show them something they didn't know they needed to see. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then dismissed her. Outside, the Pacific wind cut across the base cold and relentless. Kai walked back to her barracks alone, her ribs aching from an earlier log PT evolution, her mind already running through what Roscoe would design for the final test. She understood his resistance. He wasn't cruel. He was scared that politics would override performance, scared that compromise would get his men killed, scared that everything he'd built his career protecting was being dismantled by people who'd never bled for it. She understood that fear, but she also knew that fear wasn't an excuse for willful ignorance. Kai sat on the edge of her rack at 200 hours, the barracks empty and dark except for the red glow of the exit sign above the door. Her body was a catalogue of pain. Shoulders knotted from the swim, ribs bruised from the log carry, hands raw from rope climbs that had reopened old caluses. She pressed her thumb into the pressure point below her left collarbone, a field trick Brooks had taught her to reset an overstimulated nervous system, and exhaled slowly through her nose. On the small table beside her bunk sat a photograph in a battered waterproof case. It showed two women in dusty combat uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders, faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but grinning like they'd just survived the end of the world. Brooks was on the left, her smile wide and unguarded. Kai was on the right, younger, softer, still believing that courage and competence were enough to change systems built on decades of tradition. The photo had been taken 6 hours before the ID. Kai picked it up, traced the edge of Brooks' face with her thumb, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came every time she let herself remember. Brooks had been the kind of leader who made you want to be better, not through intimidation, but through example. She'd carried extra ammunition for the privates on long patrols. She'd walked point in the most dangerous sectors. She'd believed, genuinely, fiercely believed, that women in combat weren't a political statement but a tactical necessity, and that proving it required flawless execution, not speeches. Kai set the photo down and touched the back of her neck, fingers finding the 3 raised pinpoints of scarred skin where the tattoo ink had settled. The constellation had been Brooks' idea, sketched on the back of a water bottle label during a night watch rotation in Bigram. Brooks had said that if they were going to operate in the shadows, they should at least have something permanent to remind them they'd existed. 3 months after Brooks died, Kai had walked into that tattoo shop in Fayetteville and made it real. She thought about Roscoe, about the contempt in his voice, and realized he wasn't her enemy. He was a man trying to protect something sacred, and he couldn't see that she was trying to do the same thing. The SEALs who dismissed her weren't villains. They were products of a system that had taught them to fear weakness more than they valued adaptability. Kai stood, rolled her shoulders until something popped, and walked to the small window. Outside, the obstacle course stood silent under harsh floodlights waiting. She'd run it tomorrow. She'd run it until her legs gave out, and then she'd run it again, because that's what Brooks would have done. And when Roscoe threw his final test at her, she'd meet it the same way she'd met every test since Helmand, with cold, quiet certainty that failure wasn't an option. She whispered Brooks' name into the dark, a ritual she'd never broken, and went back to bed. Roscoe announced the final evolution at 0500 on the 3rd morning. He called it an operational stress assessment, but everyone knew it was designed to break Kai in front of an audience. The evolution would last 12 hours. It would combine land navigation, simulated combat scenarios, medical evaluations, and adaptive problem-solving under extreme fatigue. The SEAL operators would rotate through stations in teams. Kai would run every station consecutively alone without breaks, while being evaluated by the entire instructor cadre. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching but not interfering. He'd approved the plan, but even he looked uncertain about what Roscoe had designed. The first station was a 7-mile ruck march with a 65-pound pack, full combat load, and an M4 carbine through the soft sand hills north of the base. The route was deliberately indirect, requiring constant terrain association and dead reckoning with a map and compass. No GPS. Kai started at 0530, the sky still dark, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. By mile 3, her lower back was on fire. By mile 5, she was using mental arithmetic to distract herself from the pain. Calculating pace counts, estimating elevation changes, reciting the Ranger creed silently in her head. She finished in 87 minutes, 4 minutes under the cutoff. Roscoe was waiting at the checkpoint with a stopwatch. He didn't congratulate her. He told her to hydrate and move immediately to Station 2. Station 2 was a force-on-force simulation using training ammunition, rubber bullets fired from modified weapons. Kai had to clear a compound while instructors playing enemy combatants engaged her from multiple angles. Her heart rate was already spiking from the ruck. Now, with adrenaline flooding her system and her vision tunneling from exhaustion, she had to make tactical decisions in real time. She took 2 hits, one to the shoulder, one to the thigh, but neutralized 4 threats and secured the objective in under 6 minutes. The evaluator, a senior SEAL chief, marked her performance without comment. Station 3 was a simulated casualty scenario. A role player, one of the SEAL operators, was lying in the sand with a fake sucking chest wound and a simulated arterial bleed from the upper thigh. Kai had 90 seconds to assess, prioritize, and treat. She moved without hesitation, sealing the chest wound with an occlusive dressing, applying a tourniquet 3 inches above the simulated injury, and calling out the MARH protocol. Massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia, in a voice that didn't waver despite the fact that her hands were shaking from fatigue. The medical evaluator, a SEAL corpsman, gave a single nod. It was the first sign of approval she'd seen all day. By 1500 hours, Kai had been moving for 10 straight hours. Her uniform was soaked through with sweat and salt water from an earlier surf passage drill. Her hands were blistered and bleeding from rope climbs. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The SEAL operators had finished their rotations hours ago and were now standing in loose formation near the grinder, watching her with expressions that had shifted from mockery to something closer to reluctant curiosity. Roscoe called her to the final station. It was the obstacle course, the infamous O course that had ended the careers of countless operators. But Roscoe had modified it. Every obstacle now required her to carry a 40-pound sandbag. And halfway through at the cargo net climb, there was a final twist. Garrett was waiting at the base of the net with a tactical radio. He told Kai that updated intelligence had just come in, simulated enemy movement toward a friendly position. She had 90 seconds to complete the climb, retrieve an MGRS grid coordinate from the platform at the top, descend, and relay a tactical situation report over the radio using proper brevity codes, all while instructors shouted conflicting information and time hacks to create auditory chaos. Kai slung the sandbag over her shoulder and started climbing. Her hands slipped twice on the rough rope. Her forearms felt like they were tearing apart from the inside. At the top of the platform, she grabbed the laminated card, memorized the 10-digit grid in 4 seconds, and descended faster than she'd climbed, controlled falls between handholds. On the ground, she grabbed the radio, keyed the mic, and transmitted the tactical update without a single error. Her voice was hoarse and ragged, but every word was clear and precise. Garrett checked his evaluation sheet. Everything was correct. Kai finished the O course in 12 minutes, 9 seconds, slower than her best time, but faster than 70% of the SEALs who'd run it fresh that morning. When she crossed the finish line, she didn't collapse. She stood at attention, chest heaving, and waited for Roscoe to dismiss her. He didn't. Instead, he walked up to her, his face unreadable, and told her there was one more thing. Roscoe held up a radio handset and told Kai that a real-world training scenario had just been transmitted from higher command. A Navy helicopter conducting a training flight had gone down 15 miles inland. 2 crew members were injured, 1 critically. Ground extraction assets were delayed due to weather. She had to coordinate a simulated casualty evacuation using only the information provided, demonstrate proper triage procedures, and brief the entire operational plan to the command staff, who were now assembling on the grinder. It wasn't a simple drill anymore. It was a test of operational level knowledge that most O4s would struggle with under ideal conditions. Kai took the handset, received the initial report, and immediately started processing. She asked for a map and a terrain overlay. Garrett handed them to her without comment. She plotted the crash site, identified the nearest suitable landing zone based on terrain and weather constraints, calculated distances, determined required resources, and assessed potential threats. Her mind was running on pure muscle memory now, dozens of real missions in places where mistakes resulted in flag-draped coffins. She turned to face the assembled group. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was there, arms still crossed. So was Commander Adrian Merrick, the executive officer of the NSW Center, a SEAL with 19 years in, 3 deployments with DVJRU, and a reputation for being one of the sharpest tactical minds in the community. Roscoe, Garrett, Lima, and a dozen SEAL operators from the training class stood in formation, waiting. Kai delivered the operational brief in under 4 minutes. She covered the standard 5-paragraph order: situation, mission, execution, sustainment, command, and signal, without notes. Without hesitation, and with a level of tactical precision that belonged to someone who'd done this under fire in hostile territory. She recommended a split-team ground approach with air cover on standby, identified environmental hazards, specified communication protocols, and outlined contingency plans for multiple failure scenarios. When she finished, the grinder was silent except for the distant sound of surf breaking against the beach. Commander Merrick stepped forward. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes were calculating, measuring. He asked Kai a single question: where had she learned to brief like that? Kai hesitated. For 3 years she'd kept the secret. For 3 years she'd lived in the shadows because operational security demanded it. But standing here, in front of men who'd spent their entire adult lives proving they were worthy of the trident they wore, she realized that hiding wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was just perpetuating the same ignorance that had gotten Brooks killed. She reached up with her right hand and pulled her hair back, fully exposing the small constellation tattooed behind her left ear. The reaction was immediate. Garrett's eyes went wide. Lima took a half step back. Roscoe's face drained of color. Hayes, who'd suspected but hadn't been certain, closed his eyes briefly and exhaled through his nose. Commander Merrick stared at the tattoo for a long moment, then looked at Kai's face, and his expression shifted from confusion to sharp recognition. He asked her call sign. She told him Phantom. Merrick's jaw tightened. He'd heard that call sign before, 18 months ago, in a classified briefing about an operation in eastern Syria where an unknown element had provided precision overwatch fire that saved a pinned-down SEAL element from being overrun by ISIS fighters. He'd been told it was a Delta unit. He hadn't been told it was a woman who officially didn't exist. Roscoe finally spoke, his voice rough and uncertain. He asked how long she'd been operational. Kai told him 3 years, 4 combat deployments, 21 direct action missions. Roscoe looked at Hayes, then back at Kai. For the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't see a political statement or a training disruption. He saw an operator. Commander Merrick stepped forward and addressed the group. He confirmed that Sergeant First Class Kai was on temporary assignment from a joint Special Operations Command unit, that her presence was sanctioned at the highest levels, and that everything they'd witnessed over the past 72 hours was exactly what modern special operations looked like when executed by the best of the best. He turned back to Kai, came to attention and saluted her. After a long pause, Roscoe did the same. 3 days later, Lennox Kai stood in Commander Merrick's office with new orders in hand. She was being assigned as a liaison instructor to the Naval Special Warfare Center for a 6-month rotation. Her job was to develop integrated training protocols for joint special operations, with emphasis on adaptive problem-solving and unconventional tactics in complex environments. It was a real assignment, with her real name on official paperwork, and for the first time in 3 years she didn't have to hide. Roscoe requested a private meeting before she officially started. They met outside the compound, near the beach, where the sound of crashing waves covered their conversation. He didn't apologize. SEALs didn't apologize for protecting their standards. But he told her he'd been wrong about her. He told her he'd spent the last 72 hours reading after-action reports that were so heavily redacted they looked like blank pages with scattered words. But what he could read made his own combat deployments look like training exercises. He asked her what she needed from him going forward. Kai told him she needed him to stop seeing gender and start seeing capability. She told him that Brooks had died because the system was so afraid of political failure that it refused to adapt tactically. She told him that the next generation of operators, male or female, needed leaders who cared more about mission success than tradition for tradition's sake. Roscoe listened, his weathered face unreadable, then nodded slowly. He told her he'd make it happen. 2 weeks into her assignment, Kai was running a navigation exercise when she saw Petty Officer Voss struggling with his terrain association. She walked over, knelt beside him in the sand, and calmly walked him through techniques that weren't in the manual but worked in the field when maps didn't match reality. Voss listened, corrected his plot, and thanked her quietly. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. One evening, Kai returned to her quarters and found a handwritten note slipped under her door. It was from Lieutenant Commander Hayes. JSOC had requested her personnel file be forwarded to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. They wanted to discuss integrated assault team structures for future operations. Hayes had recommended her as lead consultant. Kai sat on her bunk, holding the note, and thought about Brooks. She thought about the promise she'd made in that dusty compound in Helmand, and about the constellation hidden behind her ear that had finally been seen. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But for the first time since Brooks died, Kai felt like she was moving forward instead of just surviving. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the darkening ocean. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of amber and red. Somewhere in the distance, the bell remained silent.